Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We're so pleased to have you here. My name is Allison O'Connor. I'm with CSU Extension in Larimer County. My co pilot is Kathy Anderson with Adams County Extension, and our presenter is Eric Hammond, who I will introduce in just one moment. A couple of housekeeping things, and hopefully, Eric, you might talk about Catalpa. Otherwise, it's a great tree for your landscape, just as an FYI. CSU is an equal opportunity access and non-discrimination university. If we can do anything to accommodate your needs, let us know. Also visit the website for more information. We are recording this webinar, so if you need to leave or something happens, don't worry, you can catch it on the flip side at planttalk.org/webinars. We will put that link into the chat. That's where you can sign up for upcoming webinars and also see what we have already done this season. So check that out. If you do have questions today, please use the Q&A. Kathy and I will do what we can to answer those. Otherwise, we will toss them to Eric when he has a moment. There are two more classes on the What's Killing Your Plants webinar series. There's one this Friday on squash bugs, so if that's an ailment you are facing. And then on May 23rd, there's one on tree borers. And we will also post that link in the chat if you want to sign up for those. Those are also recorded. And to continue our series on the second Wednesday at noon on June 11th, Alyssa from El Paso County Extension will be talking about native plants, the media, the potting soil you need, and tips for transplanting. So we will throw that registration link in the chat and you can join us then. Without further ado, Eric Hammond is the director of the Boulder County Extension Office, and he is also a horticulturalist. He is a tree nerd, and I love saying that because I say that with great affection. And he is going to talk to us about some of the top trees for Colorado. Thanks, Eric.
All right. Thank you. Hang on here. I will work on the back end. One second. Okay. So yeah, I'm very excited to be here today to talk to you about trees for the Front Range. The topic for the talk was top trees for the Front Range, but I'm gonna, to be honest, give you a whole lot of options. There is not a one size fits all solution. For like tree recommendations or tree planting. In fact, it's kind of important that we plant a diversity of trees in the urban forest to help give us some protection against like disease and insect issues, which might affect only one species and things like that. So, if you're here looking for, my number one recommendation, I'm gonna like disappoint you a little bit probably because I'm gonna give you more just a whole bunch of ideas. So. Some things to think about. One, a question that always comes up is what's a tree versus a shrub? Um, this is a little joke, joke here, but obviously, it is a kind of an interesting question. Like, when does a shrub become a tree? At what height does a shrub become a tree? And a lot of that's just made up, like it's a human thing. We kind of arbitrarily decide, but usually we think of trees as things that tend to have single stems be taller than, something like, 15 feet. But I think it's kind of like one of those things where like, when you see it, like, oh, that's a tree versus that's a shrub. We have a couple we'll talk about that kind of like skirt the line there. Um, I think the other thing to kind of have here at the start of the talk is to remember that trees are complex living organisms. Um, they have, of course, like the part we're all used to seeing, the above ground piece, the stems that hold the leaves that, are doing photosynthesis, right? But within those stems and underneath the ground, there's this whole complex set of things going on. We have a root system, which is actually, if you weren't aware, like the root system of a tree is much of a mature tree is oftentimes much more widespread than the canopy. It can be 2 to 5 times the diameter of the canopy. We tend to think of tree roots as being or as being really deep, but in fact, especially in clayey soils like we have on a lot of the Front Range here, most of the roots are in the top 12 inches, like, a huge percentage of the roots in the top 12 inches. of soil because that's where the water is, as it comes from the sky, it's in the top layers of soil. Those roots also need air. They need particularly oxygen, so that they can do respiration, which takes the products of photosynthesis and turns them into usable energy for them. Two, making sure you plant the tree correctly, and that is critical. We've learned more and more over the years that how a tree is transplanted, how it's planted or transplanted into a landscape is really important in determining its long-term success. And then the care of the tree while it reestablishes its root system in the new site is also critical, particularly watering. So I'll touch on those things there at the end of the talk a little bit, but we're going to spend most of this talk talking about the first one there, picking the right species for the site. And so if you're thinking about picking a tree species, here's some things you might, or a tree for a landscape, here's some things you might want to think about. One, I always throw in a plug, and I already mentioned this for diversity. We should not be planting all the same things. We should plant as diverse a set of trees in a landscape or across an urban forest as possible. And these are some of the reasons like why, these are some of the reminders about why that's important. This is emerald ash borer, right? So it's been here now for a decade, pretty much. And if you have an ash tree, you have to treat it for emerald ash borer, or it'll be killed. So, ash was a huge is and was a huge component of urban forests. So when this pest showed up from Asia, and literally it will kill all ash trees in an area where it's established, that's a big deal for us because ash was such a huge component of the urban forest. Now, if ash had been 5% of the urban forest, where maybe they were 20 to 40, depending where you were, if they were 5% of the urban forest, this pest is not as big a deal to us, right? So this is one of the reasons why diversity is important to us. This is a tree being girdled for Dutch elm disease. This same sort of thing, except it's a disease that came through in the 70s and 80s. And then this is cankers from thousand canker disease of walnuts, and that's another issue that's like threatening all walnuts. So if you have a diverse forest, these things mean less to you, is the take home there. We ought to be thinking about the water needs of what we're planting. We live in a dry place. There's just no getting around it. This is the current drought map for Colorado. You might recognize our little square state. The northern part of the Front Range is doing fairly well. There you can see white means no technical drought. The west slope is in a pretty severe, a pretty severe drought at the moment, and the southern part of the state is also drier. The snowpack, also, if you're interested in this sort of thing, the snowpack is melting very rapidly this year, which is not a good thing for water users. We'd like it to melt nice and slow, so we can use it over time, whereas it's coming down quite quick. So this year is, this is kind of the story of the last few years. Last, when I say few, maybe like decades here. So we want to think about trees that are able to tolerate that. And a big part of that is that in our area, most trees need supplemental water. I need to get a better picture, but this is Pawnee Buttes National Grassland. This is what a lot of the Front Range that's not in the foothills would have looked like, something similar to this before Europeans showed up and colonized it. So, you know, the trees that we did have natively on the Front Range, the plains portion anyways, were by rivers, streams, and lakes. There were not a lot of trees out on the plains. So it's a tough place to be a tree. Um, Growth rate, this is a big one. I just always think about it's the tortoise and the hare story. Everybody wants a fast-growing tree, but fast-growing trees tend to have problems. They tend to be short-lived, they tend to be weak-wooded, they tend to be prone to disease. Like literally their cells, because that extra growth comes from stretching cells further during expansion. So they have thinner cell walls, they're more easily penetrated by disease organisms, they tend to be weaker wooded, messier, all of that. So I generally think that if we're going to bother to plant a tree, mostly we should be thinking about planting the things that are going to live longer, have a longer lived impact, and that means usually slower growing things. Along the Front Range, there are a couple other things to think about very quickly. We tend to have soils that are high pH, so we want to pick soils that trees that can tolerate our high pH. Generally speaking, clayey soils. We also do have blow areas where there's blow sand here along the Front Range, but where the people are and a lot of trees are being planted, most of the soils are clayey and high pH. So we want to pick trees that can tolerate that. Some trees cannot get nutrients, some micronutrients like iron, manganese. zinc out of high pH soils, and they tend to get chlorotic and yellow, and we want to avoid that as one particular issue around soils. And then finally, we want to think about cold hardiness. This is the USDA hardiness zone map. You can see we have a lot of 5B and 5A along the Front Range. So that's based on average minimum temperatures. So that's our zone. And then along the front, we also have this like issue which has happened enough in the last 10 years. I think it's just something that's here to stay, where it's not just extreme temperatures that we get here, but it's also the fluctuations in temperatures from hot to cold and back. There are plants that are like cold hardy to zone two, like or three, like arborvitae's one that's native all the way into Canada, where it gets much colder than here, but it has real struggle in our winters because of our changes in temperature, our sudden changes where it goes from like 70 to -16 or something like that in a day, and our dry air, which you know leads to winter desiccation. So we want to think about cold hardiness in terms of zone, but also in terms of tolerating our unique sort of conditions here along the Front Range. And then, yeah, of course, we want to think about the mature size of the trees that are going to fit the site. You'll oftentimes see trees like this planted under power lines where they're the utility company is like doing this very strange and ultimately probably not very good pruning to the tree. And everyone always is like gets angry at the utility company, but really the issue here is the person who selected the tree, right? Should have planted something that was going to be shorter than the power lines or not planted something under them at all. The utility company is going to keep the power lines free of as free as they can of risk of being damaged by trees, as branches might break in storms and stuff like that, and that's their job. So, while it is not good for this tree, the real villain here is the person who planted this tree beneath the power lines. Okay, so preamble aside, let's get into trees that you could try here along the Front Range. I'm going to break these up into common trees that I think you can find pretty easily, and then give you some ideas of things you might have to work a little further or a little bit harder to find. You might have to, call around to the nurseries before you go to make sure you have them or order them online or something like that. So we're going to start with the common ones. And the first one is one of my, I think is a great reliable shade tree, and that's bur oak. Bur oak is native to big portions of the country, but not to Colorado. It is a true large shade tree, but it takes a long time to get here. This one you can see, this picture is a little bit blurry. In Ohio is taller than a three-story building. Like it's much taller than that. It's a big, big tree, right? So they're over time, they get to be very large trees and they're very long-lived. But bur oak, um, the thing that I like about it for Colorado is that it's just really a truly adaptable plant. Clay soils, sandy soils, urban soils, doesn't care. Kind of more wet sites, more dry sites, doesn't care. It can adapt to a variety of sites. And this picture on the left is one that I think tells that story. This is in Westminster in the North Denver metro. And this bur oak used to be growing along an irrigation canal that went through where this neighborhood is now. Things changed, and now it's in an unirrigated section of turf, and it's just chugging along. So it's probably got its roots into some water somewhere, but it does illustrate the point that they're very adaptable trees. They're not too exciting, like ornamentally, no great fall color, no great flowers, nothing like that. They're just a good, reliable shade tree. And the silly joke I tell about this is that, like, bur oak is like that friend that everyone has that's like maybe not the most exciting person. You're not going to call them to go out on a Friday night, but they have a truck and they'll show up to help you move, right? Like bur oak's a dependable plant. The only real issue it has is with a gall forming wasp that makes these little galls along the twigs. It is mostly an ornament or a cosmetic issue. It can sometimes lead to branches dying. It's a genetic issue, and so the way to avoid it is to the best thing you can do, anyways, is to buy plants from the nursery that don't have any of those galls, and then it's less likely to develop the galls over the course of their life. I crammed a lot of plants into this talk, so I'm going to go through some kind of quick. Another oak that you could try, but I think I'm a little more hesitant to recommend it than I was 2 years ago, is English oak. It's a little more refined tree. It fits a little better in some landscapes. It does get to be quite large. It keeps its leaves into the winter brown on the plant, which I like. I know some people really don't, but it adds texture to a landscape in the winter. Unfortunately, this species is being affected by a native borer that's actually in the same family uh, genus, actually, I believe, as emerald ash borer, which is gamble oak borer, which is a native to our foothills and in our shrub oak there. And in recent years, it's been a problem in some portions of the Front Range in English oak. So I think I'm kind of pressing the pause on planting English oak. But what I really want to draw your attention to is some of the cool work that's being done creating hybrids with English oak, which some of these we really don't know how big of an issue they have with that borer, but these hybrids that are out there. So for years, there's been this upright English oak on the market, Quercus robur fastigiata. So nice, columnar plant, but tended to have problems in the winter. You can see this branch that's out of the canopy here. All these branches that are really upright and really long tend to come apart in snowstorm, make the tree prone to coming apart in snowstorms. But what's happened is there's been a lot of work crossing English oak with other oaks, like in this case, English oak robur is being crossed with Alba, which is the true white oak, to create this oak called Crimson Spire oak, which I think is a real winner from a lot of perspective, from a lot of different like angles for landscapes. It's a smaller tree, it's narrow and it's upright, so it fits a lot of the modern smaller landscapes that are showing up along the Front Range. It's pretty drought tolerant. And on top of all that, it has red fall color. So those like a lot of the boxes that we want in it that people want in a tree here along the Front Range. And so this Crimson Spire Oak checks a lot of them. There are a lot of other of these hybrids in the market. Regal Prince is also very common. The fall color is more of a yellow with this one. It also is a good choice, especially for smaller landscapes. So that's English oak may not be something we could plant, but that Crimson Spire and some of those other hybrids I think are really good options. The next tree I want to talk about is one that's actually probably, man, I don't think there's much of a problem about it. It's overplanted along the Front Range already, but it is a very tough tree and good for a lot of urban sites. So I think I'm still going to mention it because you'll probably see it around there, and that's honey locust. This is a member of the legume family. If you're growing it from seed, it can have seed pods and these like really gnarly thorns, but most of the ones on the market are thornless and nearly podless. Um, Trees can either, plants are generally, referred to as either being, uh, they either have, I guess that the simple way to put it, they either have genders on different trees. So each individual has, is either male or female, and the female plants develop seeds and, other fruit. And then other plants have both genders in the same tree. So they'll have male and female flowers on the same tree. And so that's how we think about things. But in the case of honey locust, it actually is the plant does have male and female flowers on each tree. Um, but for the seedless ones, they bred them to be nearly all male. So occasionally you'll get one or two pods. So I always think that's kind of interesting to think about. Honey locust gets a nice yellow fall color. It is a very adaptable plant. It doesn't mind pollution, urban sites where pollution might be an issue, tolerates poor soils. They get several different fungal canker diseases, and there are borers that get into them, but very few of those issues actually tend to kill them. So um, the biggest issue with honey locust is that it's overplanted. We probably shouldn't be planting a bunch more of it because it's out there. But if you have a particularly difficult site, it's something you might think about. I once heard Michael Durr, who's a big plant person. If you know plants, he wrote the woody plant manual. Call it a junkyard dog of a tree. So that's how I always kind of think about honey locust. Yeah, this one's growing, just in this unwatered concrete landscape. There used to be a pool here of water at some point. It's just chugging along. So that's the kind of tree honey locust is. Related to honey locust and not yet overplanted, but maybe on the way, is Kentucky coffee tree. This is another member of the legume family. You can see it gets these pods just like beans and peas up here. It has these really interesting So yeah, there's the pods. It gets a nice fall, yellow fall color some years. In the winter, it tends to look kind of sparse because it has these really stout branches that support these big compound leaves. Um, the pods can hang on in the winter and add some texture. I know some people don't like pods on their tree. They find them messy. I don't let stuff like that slow me down. Just mow it with the lawnmower and just go on with your life. But if it is something that you just can't get over, they do sell a podless version of this called Espresso. I think there's a couple podless ones on the market now, but Espresso is the one I'm most familiar with. Gets an interesting gray, has an interesting gray platy bark. The one of the hard things about honey locust is that when it's young, it looks just like a Charlie Brown Christmas tree. It tends to have like one stem and a branch to support, like not a lot of branching. And so that makes them kind of hard to sell in the nursery, but they grow out of that. Another fairly common tree that does well along the Front Range is catalpa, sometimes called northern, or you'll see it as western catalpa. Um, Catalpa is, of course, known for its flowers. You can see there in the picture. The flowers tend to be they're late in the spring. So they're after a lot of other things are already done blooming. So it's kind of a nice extension of the flowering season of trees and shrubs to have one in your landscape. Um, the flowers do develop into these long papery pods you can see on the edge of the tree, which some people don't like. They used to call catalpa a cigar tree because of those pods, because kids would pretend like they were um, cigars. Can get a yellow fall color. Honestly, this is about as good as the fall color as Catalpa ever gets. Lots of years, it's this kind of dirty brown or dirty green, dirty yellow rather color or brown. Um, so Catalpa is definitely one you can think about. It is a drought tolerant tree, but it really, when I say, it doesn't thrive in drought. It just tolerates it. It'll like let you know it's dry. The leaves will be scorched. It'll look kind of crispy, but it does come through drought. So that is a nice thing about Catalpa. In a very similar vein, not as ornamentally as attractive tree, but for use wise, it really overlaps is hackberry. Um, we do have a member of the hackberry, the same genus Celtis, that is native called sugarberry. That's native to parts of the Front Range. The only ones I've ever seen are in the Boulder Mountain Park, where there just tends to be like a weird amount of diversity of woody plants there because it's because of local conditions. But hackberry, this plant is not native to here, but it's not native to too far away from Colorado. Um, Hackberries, the most notable ornamental feature they have is their bark, which, like loving a tree for its bark is kind of that's like a connoisseur level plant enthusiast thing, but it gets this kind of quirky bark. Um, the flowers are kind of a cream-ish, kind of with a little bit of a green tinge, but they come after the leaves are out, so you don't really notice them. They develop into this drupe fruit, so it's like the same sort of fruit that like a cherry has, and they are edible. And in fact, apparently were an important source of protein for early humans. You can go online and find videos of people making like energy bars out of them, grinding them up and adding things and making energy bars there. Um, the fall color it's like a dirty green, not that nice of a fall color, but will tolerate drought, is adaptable to a variety of landscapes. I think hackberry is, one of the common plants in the urban forest, and it does well here. There you can see kind of like one in the fall. Oh, catalpa got split up. Well, that's all right. So I think the last of the common ones that I wanted to give you here was sensation box elder. So box elder is a native plant to Colorado along rivers and streams. It's not a great plant when grown from like seed, it's not a great plant for most landscapes because it's extremely messy. And moreover, it tends to attract these little bugs called box elder bugs that have like kind of red shoulders and black bodies. And they're not like harmful, but they are a nuisance to a lot of people. They'll come into houses. Um, those bugs feed on the seeds of box elder. So um, the reason that I throw sensation box elder in this talk is that it is a seedless cultivar, so you don't have the issue with box elder bugs because no seeds mean no box elder bugs. And it supposedly has a little better branching angles to the straight genus species, so it doesn't come apart in storms as much. Um, it also gets a nicer fall color. So I think box elder is one we can plant. It is a very tough tree, tolerates salts, tolerates poor soils. I see these in parking lot islands all over the Front Range and those like really tough sites just doing really well. We did have maybe some damage in them a couple years ago from maybe I don't actually remember if we determined if it was from ozone or cold, but those were the two things we were thinking about. But I've seen just so many doing well that I think it's still one that we can plant um, here along the Front Range. So box elder is a member of the maple family, but it doesn't have those stereotypical maple leaves. So I wouldn't recommend any box elder, but sensation is one to plant if that you could give a shot to. So let's check our time. As predicted, I put too many trees in this talk, so I'm just gonna keep rolling through here. I want to give you some other seed trees for the sake of like encouraging diversity and creating demand for plants that maybe are not that common yet in landscapes, so the industry maybe will pursue them more than they are. Some kind of cool trees that you could try. And the first, this one is getting more common, is chinkapin oak. This is a species of oak that's native to a huge portion of the country. Um, so, but it hasn't been, sorry, my phone is beeping. It hasn't been like um, developed and cultivated as a nursery in the nursery trade because they're just frankly better oaks for other places in the country. But for here, chinkapin oak is a great tree. It gets a kind of it's we grow a lot of the oaks from seed, so the fall color can vary. But in the best case, this gets kind of a wine or merlot-y sort of fall color. It is relatively fast growing. Um, it's a pretty polite tree in the landscape. The bark can be kind of interesting, and more importantly, when the seed source is correct. So from a seed source where the soil you find a population growing in a more alkaline soil, like the Flint Hills of Kansas, which is where a lot of the chinkapin oak acorns for the ones we're growing along the Front Range were collected. It does really well in our landscape. So I've planted this everywhere I've lived for the past, 12 years. Um, every time anyone sees the one in my front yard that's just been there, I think 10 years now, they're always like, "Oh, was such a nice tree." So I think this is one that you can find more commonly now. You will be able to find it at local nurseries if you call around, and one I think you could be planting more. There's kind of what the fall color looks like. This is from a multi-site trial I was involved in my graduate work where we looked at a bunch of different trees, including this one. There are some other oaks I just wanted to mention. I couldn't help myself that are out there that you could think that are either being already in the trade or I think could be more common in the trade. On the outsides of this slide, there's Texas red oak and Shumard oak, which both are native to parts south of Colorado, and they exist as a gradient along the southern part of the country and kind of the dry hills of Texas. And um, I think Texas red oak is the better of the two from everyone I've talked to, but Shumard is another one of the red oaks that you can grow here, and we'll see. In fact, I have a tough time telling them apart sometimes. So either one, I think you could try. Texas red, I think, is a little better here along the Front Range. Gets that brilliant red fall color, but doesn't have the issues that the true red oak, the red oak, Quercus rubra, has in our soils where it gets chlorotic. Swamp white oak is pretty common in the industry already. I I think it's kind of a controversial plant. Some people tell you they love it, some people tell you they hate it. I have seen a lot of them looking chlorotic. I think they like it wetter than a lot of I don't think they like have a ton of drought tolerance. And I think that some of them, again, all the oaks are grown from seed, so they're genetically different. So some of them have a problem getting micronutrients like iron out of our soils. I do see chlorotic ones around. And then finally, I'm going to talk more about this one later, so I'll be very quick. Gamble oak is the oak, the scrubby oak that's the scrub oak that's native to the Front Range. And I think it does have a place in landscapes, although it has some cautions, like it tends to sucker, and definitely a smaller tree. I'll talk more about that later when I talk about native plants in particular, native trees in particular. But so these are some other oaks that you could think about. Texas red oak, I think, is a lovely tree, and so is Shumard. Another rare tree that's becoming more common is Caddo sugar maple. So, um, sugar maple, believe it or not, is native all the way down from the Northeast to Oklahoma. And these Caddo sugar maples are selected from a population of sugar maples growing in Caddo County, Oklahoma, and kind of the limestony hills they have there. So it's a higher pH soil. It's Oklahoma, so you know it's hot. Um, and so these this sugar maples from this subpopulation tend to be more tolerant of our alkaline soils and more able to handle our hot, dry summers. And we've been growing them here along the Front Range now for 20 years, and I think we can safely say that they don't get chlorosis the way that some other sugar maples do, and they do better. They do better in the heat than the others there. So not only is the idea good, but we now have proof that that tends to work. So on top of that, they get red fall color, which is what everyone, that's one of the top things people want in a shade tree. So these Caddo sugar maples, I think, are a great plant. There used to be Caddo sugar maple, which was a selection called John Parr, which was he was a plant guy in Oklahoma who selected it. But now all the big national nurseries have their own selection of these Caddo type sugar maples that I think are really worth trying. So here's one. This was a place I lived at for a while in Erie that I planted one. So I'm not just blowing smoke here, right? I did practice what I preach. The final, I think, one here that I have to give a shot is an elm that is still pretty hard to find, but maybe there's hope for that in the future, and that's David elm. This is an Asiatic elm, and what that means is that Dutch elm disease, which came from Asia and devastated all the American elms that were planted across North America, um, that this species has resistance to Dutch elm disease. And like I'm telling you, from a distance, you don't look too closely, you would just think it's an American elm. It has that great vase-shaped habit that we liked with American elm. Fall color is nice. It seems to have less problems with the scale insects that are such a problem for American elm. So this is one I really like. I'd like to have one to plant one personally too, but I don't have not planted one here yet. But anyways, I think it's a very exciting tree and one to maybe track down. J. Frank Schmidt Nurseries is working on an introduction based on genetics from Fort Collins, from some of the trees the former city forester Tim Buchanan planted there, which I think is going to be called Choice City Elm. It'll be a type of David elm that might be a little bit easier to find, might make it a little bit easier to find than it has been. Oh, I had another. I threw this one in here because I really do like this plant. It is definitely a smaller tree, which is a good thing in a lot of landscapes. This is a selection of big tooth maple, which is native to Colorado, but not the Front Range. It's more native to the West Slope and the southwest part of the state in particular. And a lot of taxonomists still argue about whether grandidentatum is actually its own species or it's just a subspecies of sugar maple. So if you're like to nerd out on that sort of stuff, you can look into it. But this is a selection from the Manzano Mountains of New Mexico that is more tree-like and has this nice, consistent pumpkin fall color. It is pretty fast growing. This is my graduate school, my master's, the work I did for my master's, the research trial. And these trees will always make me so nervous because they'd put on a second flush of growth like in August. So they're indeterminate, like some tomatoes are indeterminate and keep growing. And I'd always just be like, is it going to harden off before the winter? But it always did. So relatively fast growing, nice fall color, drought tolerant, right? Native to the Southwest, so it has some of that drought tolerance with it. And I think it's a great one. There are other selections of Grandin Totem that are out there now too that also are superior, but this is my favorite. So those are for the deciduous trees. Those are some. That's a pretty long list of ones that I think you couldn't go too wrong with, right? And I'm all for planting diversity, so I rarely want to say like just don't plant this species unless it's like invasive or something. But there are some trees that I just think we have to use a lot of caution in landscapes. And there are some trees that I think one or two species that I think we should avoid in landscapes. So I just want to go through those really quick because some of them are really common. So here's the ones to use with caution. Freeman type maples. These are crosses of red maple and silver maple, and they were hoping and did in some ways get the best of both species. They're fast growing, but they also get the red fall color of red maple. Unfortunately, they also have the problems of both of their parents. They tend to get chlorotic and high pH soil, so that means yellow, highlight or yellow midsummer. So one of the number one calls into the extension office starting late in July and into August is these yellowing plants that are getting chlorotic because they can't get iron out of our soil. And either people call saying, "How do I fix it?" or they call saying, "What's that cool yellow plant? I'd like to plant one." Um, anyways, these Freeman type maples should only be used if you know your soil pH is neutral or a little acidic, and they should be care should be taken to prune them correctly because they tend to get really bad structure and then have issues in snowstorms. But most sites along the Front Range, even though this is very widely planted, it's not a good tree. It's a similar story with the true red oak, Quercus rubra. It just can't get those micronutrients out of our soils that are, at least if you have a clayey soil that's high in pH. So only plant this in areas where you know it's a little more neutral. I've seen nice ones kind of going into the foothills in Boulder, but they have more neutral soil there. So we also have an insect issue with this Kermes scale and an associated bacterial blight. So I just would avoid it, but maybe some sites it could be okay. And then maybe one that some people won't like to hear, cottonwoods, willows, and many other poplars are just not good trees for landscapes. This is where they belong, in more naturalized settings by lakes and rivers. They need space, they're messy, and they need water. So they're just not good plants for most of our like modern landscapes. Maybe for parks or natural areas, or again by water is where a lot of those things could go. So I would not put those into the average landscape. And then I added this one, and I really hate to have to do it because there are nice trees and have bring a lot to landscapes. But I think we have to be careful planting new lindens right now along the Front Range, and the only reason for that is Japanese beetle. Again, these are like mesic trees; they're not for every landscape, anyways. But Japanese beetle is such a established problem now, and they love lindens. So not only they love lindens, so they skeletalize the leaves and make the trees kind of look like they're scorching from a distance, but the beetles are on the plants the same time as the flowers, so it's very difficult to treat for the beetles without hurting pollinators. So I just wouldn't plant a linden right now with where we are at with Japanese beetle. You know, any of them, any of the common ones anyways, I wouldn't plant them. If you do want to grow a linden, you could try Tilia tomentosa, which is silverleaf linden. The leaves are hairier, and I guess the beetles have a little less preference for them for munching. So, and then finally, the only, I guess there's really two. I only have one in here that I would just not plant at all. That's again, we're not talking invasive plants like Russian olive here, but in terms of trees that are, we have been planting are the ashes. Doesn't matter if it's white ash, green ash, black ash, any of the ashes that got planted along the Front Range in the past. We just shouldn't. Emerald ash borer is too big a problem. You're planting a tree that you're going to have to treat with an insecticide for life. So if you have one that's already established, you can decide if you're going to keep it and if should treat it or remove it. But I wouldn't plant a new one at this point. And then I don't have a slide in it, but I also wouldn't plant any of the juglans, any of the walnuts here because of thousand canker disease at this point. Okay, so we have about 20 minutes to go, and I have the ornamental trees plus some conifers to go into. So actually, I'm thinking I'm okay on my schedule. I don't know if there's any questions you all wanted me to answer at this point. I can look too, I guess.
No questions, but since you've paused, there may be a question that comes in.
And if there's not, it's a good excuse for me just to drink coffee. So,
And drink coffee. I think you can continue on too when you're finished.
okay. Okay. Well, we'll keep rolling. So let's talk about ornamental trees. So when I say ornamental, these are trees that are generally a little smaller. They're usually planted for their flower or some other outstanding ornamental feature. Any tree can be ornamental in the broadest sense, but that's what we mean with this group of trees. Um, I should also say that with ornamental trees, a lot of the features come from like specific selections. So I'm giving you big broad ones, but like I'm gonna talk about crab apples. But within the big basket of crab apple, there are hundreds of selections of crab apples that have different flower colors. Some have double flowers, some are fruitless. There's really one for every like situation. So I think we got to get back to talking about crab apples as in a positive way. Like I know most of my life as a horticulturalist, when I say crab apple, people kind of act like That's fine and all, but like they think of them as messy or having issues with fire blight. But like, man, when they're in bloom, like in this picture, like what else? What else looks like that in a landscape in Colorado? Like they bring so much. They have flowers that support pollinators. If you plant a variety with fruit, that can support wildlife as well. They have fruitless varieties, so if you don't want fruit, you can find one that doesn't have fruit. Um, they have ones that are very resistant to fire blight. You just have to make sure that you're buying one that says fire blight resistance on the label. So I think they just are when they're blooming, and as my old professor said, when they're in their glory, there's few things that are quite as showy as a crabapple in a landscape. And on top of all that, they're drought tolerant. They tolerate crummy conditions. Apples come from an area of Eurasia that has a climate very similar to Colorado. So like they're pretty well adapted for here. Um, and I think they're one that we ought to be talking about in a more positive light. So I just got some photos. You're like, I mean, come on, look at that. Here's more of a pink variety. This one has a double flower. There's just all sorts of them out there, right? So I think it's one we should be maybe talking about more than we do. Um, Another group of ornamental plants, which are pretty common, are the hawthorns, and I'm going to highlight particularly Russian hawthorn. This is again native to Mongolia, which has a climate that's pretty similar to Colorado. It was made a selection made by uh, I believe someone from Durham Botanic Gardens. And I mean, it really just has this tree just has it all. It has beautiful white flowers in the spring, just buzzing with pollinators in the spring. Like literally, when you go by the tree, you can hear it buzzing. The flowers become when fertilized the fruit, the hawthorn. The fruit hangs on the tree with this one most years, and after it freezes, then birds eat it, so it doesn't make a huge mess beneath the tree. Some years I have noticed they make more of a mess than others. Um, so yeah, so it's got this attractive fruit, and then it has attractive yellow fall color as well that you can kind of see in the picture on the left. So, and on top of that, the bark's interesting, and it's one of the trees that's just like truly xeric here along the Front Range. Like once it's established, it probably won't need extra irrigation unless it's like a really prolonged drought. And even then, it might come through it, but it would appreciate some irrigation. So, I think it's just really a great ornamental plant for our area. There are two other hawthorns, which are there are more than two, but there are two other that are decently common that do pretty well as well. Washington's on the left gets these smaller orange fruits, very attractive, a little more susceptible to fire blight. So something to know about Washington, but tough in terms of being xeric. And then the one that's most widely planted is thornless cockspur. Sorry, those are backwards. Cockspur thornless hawthorn. Um, or thornless cockspur hawthorn. Now my brain's confusing which one's right. Either one will get you there. These are, you see all over white flowers. The flowers of this one have a very musky, kind of really unappealing smell in the spring, but it's very tough plant, and you'll see it specked a lot in commercial landscapes, and does fine here. Fine to plant. The last couple I'll talk about quickly are Japanese tree lilac, which does very well in our area and is it flowers a little later than the other lilacs, so it kind of extends the season. It's pretty drought tolerant and has interesting bark. This is definitely one you can give a try. They do get pretty large in the long haul. That's so like I've seen some recently that were like 30-foot tall trees, so they do take some space eventually. And then finally, Tatarian maple. When I learned my ornamental maples, there was Tatarian maple and Ganala maple, and they were separate species. But now, Tatarian maple, or sorry, Ganala maple is listed as subspecies of Tatarian. So I'm just going to say Tatarian, but you might see some of these marketed as Ganala. Generally, the ones marketed as Tatarian, I think, do a little better in our soil. The ones marketed as Ganala sometimes get a little chlorotic. This one in the picture is a particular selection called Hot Wings, which was Fort Collins wholesale selection, and then Plant Select promoted it. In this case, they do get an attractive white flower, but in those flowers become these these double samara fruits. So samaras are winged fruits, these little helicopter fruits, which are bright red, and so they extend the season of interest. Um, Only problem with this tree is that they market it as having better branching angles and not coming apart as in storms as much. but it comes apart in storms. You need to watch it with your pruning. Keep the lateral branches small. Select lateral branches that have a nice wide branching angle. Again, it does. I've seen a lot of them come apart in snowstorms, but otherwise, it's a great plant. Okay, so as we wrap up, those are my kind of recommendations for ornamental things. There are other things. Calorie parrot is great here, but it's just so blah. I mean, it's everywhere, and it has some issues with it too. There are other ones, but those are kind of my favorites of the ornamental trees. I want to do a brief note here. There's currently, and I think, and I think it's very good push to have more natives in landscapes, more native plants in landscapes. I want to note that many of the native woody plants, or trees in particular, just they aren't suited towards managed landscapes. They're either like cottonwoods, they get too big and they're too messy, or box elder, it's kind of the same story, like as beautiful as these two pictures here are. Um, those trees don't aren't they have sensation box elder okay, but a lot of box elders I wouldn't plant in a managed landscape. Cottonwoods I wouldn't plant in a managed landscape. Other aspens, right? Everyone wants to plant an aspen. That's a native tree, but they sucker and they're short-lived and they're not good down in the heat here along the Front Range. So I wouldn't use a lot of those native trees in mini like in a managed landscape. Um, Gamble oak we talked about that could be used if you have space to let it sucker a little bit. That's a native tree you could use. Chokecherry is another native ornament is a native ornamental tree, or sometimes a large shrub, depending on like whether you buy a multi-stem version of it or not. Um, but it does sucker, and it's so be aware of that before you plant it. Serviceberry, I think, is another one of our natives that has a huge, bigger potential. There are, a lot of shrubs that I'll briefly mention in a second, but like serviceberry can get big enough where you might call it a small tree, or a very large shrub, and sometimes called Juneberry. And it's just a very ornamental plant. Nice flowers, nice fruit, nice fall color. The fruit is edible, tastes a little like a blueberry. So like that's one if you're looking for a native one, you could look for one of the tree forms of Amelanchier alnifolia. But a lot of the native trees just aren't unfortunately great for our landscape for landscapes. However, if you are into natives and for woody plants, a lot of the native shrubs, I think, do have a huge potential to be used in landscapes. They're attractive. They have a Western look. I'm talking about mountain mahogany, Apache plume. Um, why am I forgetting all the native shrubs? Even like dogwood is a native shrub. There are just a ton of them that I think have a much buffalo berry, you know. There are a lot of native shrubs that you might think about using in landscapes if you want to have native woody plants, but the trees are a little tricky. Okay, so we're going to wrap up and end on the conifers. I'm not going to talk about every conifer you could plant. Particularly, I'm not going to talk about the really common ones. So I'm not going to talk about, even though you could plant them, Austrian pine, which is a large pine from Europe that we grow here that does well here. Ponderosa pine, which is a native large pine, which does okay along the Front Range. I don't think it really likes it down low as much as it does in the foothills, but you could grow here. Or blue spruce. Blue spruce is overplanted. It is too big for 90% of, maybe not 90, but a big chunk of Front Range landscapes. Everyone wants that blue color, but it's just not a good plant for most landscapes. They're also kind of like they get like real picky about their watering, too much, too little. They're having problems, and they've had struggles with our sudden frost of the last few years. So I personally wouldn't plant a blue spruce at this moment, and they don't fit most landscapes anyways. But those ones are pretty well known, so I'm not going to talk about them any more than I just did. Instead, I want to kind of show you some other things that you might think about. The first one here I know has become controversial. For what, it's always been a little controversial because people don't want junipers in landscapes. They're prickly. It's actually the number one allergy that we have. The more people are allergic to junipers than anything else, like mildly allergic to them, I'm told. Um, but I think we ought to think about planting more of them, particularly our native Rocky Mountain juniper comes in a variety of colors. Some of them are very close to looking like blue spruce, can get in a variety of shapes. Some of my favorites are Woodward, which is this upright one, or Moonglow, which has this beautiful blue-green color. Um, the caveat here is, so these are before I like start telling you reasons not to plant it, these are drought tolerant. They tolerate our changes in temperature. They because they are native. They tolerate heat. I think there's just a place in landscapes for junipers. But the caveat is junipers are also higher. They create higher risk for fire. They have a lot of resin in them that makes them tend to be very flammable. So don't foundation plantings of junipers. Don't I would not plant. You're not going to want to plant junipers in the first 5 feet by the house. And if you plant them in the first 30 feet, you want to make sure that they're by themselves and spread out and not part of a cluster of other plants that if there was a fire that they could potentially spread it. And again, like if you live in a suburban setting with a lot of irrigated turf, not near the foothills, and your fire risk is lower, you probably don't have to be quite as concerned about that stuff. Not to say that you shouldn't be concerned, but you don't have to be quite as concerned. You kind of have to evaluate your own risk there with junipers. But yeah, we got to start talking about junipers in a more positive light, I think, acknowledging the fire risk, of course. Pinyon pine is another native pine. This is the picture on the left is pinyon pine in New Mexico, where they get less than 4 inches of rain a year. So very xeric. I see more issues with pinyon pine being overwatered in landscapes than underwatered. Oftentimes collected and sold from forest. They'll collect them from the forest and sell them in into communities. Um, But yeah, smaller pine, tough pine, one I think you can think about planting in your xeriscapes. Again, not great actually on the fire risk either here, so not for right near structures. A cool kind of one that maybe isn't new anymore, but is still growing in popularity is Cook Peak Arizona cypress. This is a true cypress selected from a population of Arizona cypress that was growing at high elevation on Cook Peak. So it's a little more cold hardy is the idea there. And in fact, we've had them here along the Front Range for over 20 years. The one individual selected from this population, and they come through the winters just fine. They're still mostly grown from seed, so there's a huge variation in the habit as you can see here from these pictures. Um, there are selections in the work, though there's I think a narrower selections in the work, and I can't remember, but there's a couple selections in the work that are superior that you might start seeing on the market in the next couple of years. I think this is a fun plant. Nearly has the color of blue spruce, but is just much less prone to problems here along the Front Range. So one of my favorites that is native, but to the southwestern corner of the state, not to the Front Range, is southwestern white pine. I think actually climate change, as it goes on, is going to make our area along the northern Front Range more and more suited to southwest white pine. Um, if you're familiar with the white pine from the East Coast, this tree has some of those features. You can see the very horizontal branching kind of gets a little more open, but it just doesn't have any of the problems that those have. Doesn't get chlorotic in our soils. When it's young, it's quite attractive. There are selections of this on the market that have both a more columnar habit and which have a nicer blue-green color. I think southwestern white pine, Pinus strobiformis, is a great pine here, and it's going to be even better spot for it in the future as the climate changes here. So those are some of my favorites for the evergreens there. Um, and so let's wrap up just with a couple of minutes. Just a reminder. So I said that at the start of the talk that species selection was super important. They said the other two things that were important were planting and care. So the boilerplate how to plant a tree correctly. You want a planting hole that's as big as possible, but ideally 3 to 5 times the diameter of the root ball. In the industry, sometimes it's less than that. We just say if you can get it at least twice the diameter of the root ball, that's good. But the bigger the hole, the better. We want the hole to be saucer shaped to direct the roots out and up. And we want the tree sitting on firm, undug soil so it doesn't settle. At a depth where the first root, where the flare of the tree, where it flares out to the root system like a trumpet, where the first root and flare are a couple or an inch above grade. We want the first root actually a little above grade, and that's something that sometimes gets lost. We plant a lot of trees too deeply. We want our backfill to taper from the edge of the root ball down to the edge of the hole, not cover the top of the root ball so water can get in there. We do not recommend amending the backfill. If you want to put like a shovel of compost in there, that's fine, but not heavily amending it. And then we would recommend wood mulch or another organic mulch over the backfill, but not touching the trunk to hold water in and moderate temperatures in the soil there. So this would be a proper planting hole. Shallow enough that the roots, if you remember two things, shallow enough that the first root's a little above grade, and then as wide as you can get it in a saucer shape. If you're planting containerized stock in particular, girdling roots are an epidemic right now. You can see these roots that are growing in circles here. They're never going to straighten out. Like they're going to be that way forever. And here you can see what a root collar excavation looked like on a tree that probably had a similar root system years down the line. So we recommend that you remove all those dysfunctional roots by shaving the outer edge of the root ball before planting those trees. It seems traumatic, but trust me, it works. And you will get less girdling roots develop over time if you just remove those dysfunctional roots at planting. And then finally, once you have the tree planted, the most important thing is watering it correctly. So remember that while the tree, so this period where watering is extra critical is during establishment, and the bigger the tree is, the longer that period is. And we say it takes 1 year per inch of trunk diameter for a tree to establish. So a 3 inch tree would take 3 years to establish, and a 1 inch tree would take, so this is the diameter of planting would take 1 year to establish. Watering is the most important task. Um, if you underwater a tree, it can slow establishment by years for reasons I don't have time to go into right now, but just trust me. Um, and if you underwater it enough, it can lead to the tree having enough dysfunction that it dies. So general rules, frequent light irrigation. We want to keep the root ball moist without water pooling at the bottom of the planting hole. So we're going to water it pretty often with small amounts of water during establishment. We want the root ball to feel like a wrung out sponge that, how often we water and how much is going to depend the time of year and the amount of precipitation we get, and like, is it being watered by sprinklers already, etc. So there's no substitution for just checking the root ball. Stick a screwdriver or your finger into the root ball, check moisture and water when the top 2 or 3 inches are dry. Right now, when the weather is still hypothetically a little cooler, that might mean you water it every 5 to 7 days. During the heat of the summer, that might mean every 2 days. There's no substitution for actually checking in the root ball and dialing in your irrigation based on the conditions there. The final piece here is watering where the roots are. In the first year, we assume they're just in the ball that came with the tree from the nursery, so that's all we water. The second year, we assume they're there and in the backfill. And by the third year, if everything went correct, they're out into the native soil. And now we're watering this big, broad area. So if you're using drip emitters in particular, you need to add emitters or add drip tape out further away or install like micro sprinklers to water a broader area, not just leave the one little butt emitter that came with the tree at the base. For newly planted trees, winter watering once a month will be you'll notice a huge difference in survival and establishment if you winter water them about once a month if we don't have significant precipitation. There I am with more hair watering a little tree. Um, but yeah, any questions, Cassie? Or I can look too.
Yes, someone asked if you have any tree suggestions for the Western Slope for beyond the Front Range.
Well, a lot of what I posted will do just, or a lot of what we talked about should do just fine on the western slope. Anything where I mentioned where it was native to the southwest portion of the state, like southwestern white pine, um, Manzano maple, Caddo sugar maple, Texas red oak. Uh, those all will do particularly well there, where it's a little more mild than the Front Range. But almost anything I talked about should do well on the western slope. And what I would really recommend is calling your local extension office there too and asking them for advice. I know in Grand Junction at the extension office they have a great demonstration garden there where you can go see a lot of smaller trees and shrubs. So um, there are other fun things you can grow that we can't grow on the Front Range, like wavy leaf oak. We can grow here, but it does really well there. So yeah, those would be some things off the top of my head. Chalopsis. We can't really grow chalopsis very well here along the Front Range, but it will overwinter. We can, but it dies to the ground every year. But chalopsis will overwinter oftentimes there in Grand Junction, and it has really cool flowers. So
Eric, a small evergreen tree for Denver suburbs.
yeah, I see that it says shade in there, and that's tricky. So for shade for an evergreen, most of the evergreens that we think about traditionally just aren't going to do well in shade. But So what I would suggest is if you have a shady spot and you want an evergreen, I would think about some of the broadleaf evergreens like Mahonia, so Oregon gray polly. The creeping variety is along the ground, and then there's also like a knee-high type one. It's gonna have like holly type leaves, and it doesn't mind the shade. Or maybe some of the Awonimus, like the evergreen Awonimus that are out there. Those would be your best bets for a shady area for an evergreen. I guess common juniper is Juniperus communis is a native to the foothills that it's an understory plant there, and it will tolerate some shade as well. So, um, again, my email is on the slide here. So ehammond@bouldercounty.gov, and you can send me any questions you have. I'm happy to try to answer them.
So thank you so much and have a great afternoon, everybody.